Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, spent his life exploring the hidden layers of the human mind. He studied dreams, myths, symbols, and the strange forces that move beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. Yet one of his most unsettling discoveries did not concern mental illness or even abnormal psychology. It concerned a very rare type of person. These were people who could see what almost everyone else missed. They were able to notice tiny expressions that flickered across the face in a fraction of a second. They heard the subtle changes in tone that revealed what someone was really feeling. They picked up on the shifts in posture, the weight in the air, and the energy of a room in ways that seemed impossible to explain. Jung called this ability differentiated perception. To put it in ordinary language, these people had their senses turned up to a level that most of us can hardly imagine. They were like walking lie detectors. They were like emotional X-ray machines. They were able to detect what others carefully tried to hide. At first, you might think this sounds like a remarkable gift. Who would not want to see behind the mask, to truly know what is going on in the minds and hearts of other people? Who would not want the power to tell truth from falsehood, sincerity from manipulation? It sounds almost superhuman, something that could make life easier, relationships more authentic, and decisions more informed. But Jung discovered something far darker. He came to describe this ability as dangerous, not because it harmed society, but because it harmed the very individuals who possessed it. The danger was not madness. It was not delusion. The danger was the burden of seeing too much. The world is not built for people who notice everything. Our societies, our friendships, our workplaces, even our families all rely on a kind of shared blindness. We look away from certain truths because they are too heavy, too uncomfortable, too disruptive. We pretend not to notice the cracks in a marriage, the silent resentment in a friendship, the loneliness behind a smile. Most of us survive by not paying attention, but these rare individuals cannot look away. They see it all. And that clarity, instead of being a blessing, becomes a source of suffering. Jung realized this in a deeply personal way in 1913. At that time, he himself was in the middle of a psychological crisis. His friendship and professional partnership with Sigmund Freud had collapsed, and he was trying to navigate the chaos of his own unconscious. In the midst of this turmoil, a patient entered his life who embodied the strange gift and curse of differentiated perception. She was profoundly introverted, but not in the simple sense of being shy or reserved. Her introversion was a deep withdrawal into an inner world that gave her extraordinary powers of perception. She noticed everything. When she walked into a room, she did not simply register who looked friendly or who appeared confident. She sensed who was secretly angry, who was pretending, who was weighed down by shame, and who was quietly falling apart. Jung was astonished. In his notes, he wrote that the patient had an extraordinary ability to perceive unconscious contents in others. This gift brought her distress rather than benefit. She was not guessing. She was not imagining. She was not projecting. When Jung tested her impressions, when he asked questions and followed her observations, he found them startlingly accurate. Again and again, she revealed hidden motives and concealed emotions that turned out to be real. And yet her life was unbearable. She could not make friends easily. because people felt exposed around her. They sensed that she could see through them, and this made them uncomfortable, even hostile. She could not keep jobs because her presence disrupted the delicate fabric of workplace politeness. She could not enjoy simple social interactions because small talk felt false to her. She lived as if she were standing outside the play of human society, watching everyone act out roles that she could no longer take seriously. Jung came to a disturbing realization. He was not treating an illness. This was not a case of hysteria, neurosis, or psychosis. This was something else. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when the invisible is made too visible. He was studying what it looks like when someone can perceive more than the human heart is built to carry. Most of us survive through a form of blindness. We let ourselves be fooled. We believe in surface appearances. We tell polite lies. We nod along. We accept masks. These unspoken agreements make social life possible. Without them, human interaction would collapse into raw exposure. But this patient lived without that shield. She saw everything. And this constant perception was not a gift. It was a curse. For Jung, this encounter revealed a truth that would haunt his later work. Too much awareness can be as destructive as too little. Just as ignorance can ruin a life, so can excessive perception. The human mind depends on balance. If we see too little, we stumble blindly into traps. But if we see too much, we drown in the unbearable weight of truth. Jung began to notice something else about people like this patient. They were not only highly observant, they were also strangely vulnerable to the moods and emotions of others. It was as if they did not simply perceive hidden feelings, but absorbed them. When they were around someone who was anxious, they themselves felt restless. When they were near someone who was bitter, they tasted that bitterness in their own soul. It was not empathy in the ordinary sense, where you imagine how someone else feels. It was closer to possession. Jung used the term participation mystique, a phrase borrowed from anthropology, to describe this strange fusion between people. It meant that boundaries became blurry, that the inner world of one person seeped into another. This explained why his patient was always exhausted, anxious, and overwhelmed. She was not just carrying her own thoughts and emotions. She was carrying the unconscious burdens of everyone around her. Imagine walking through a crowded street and not only noticing every glance, every micro-expression, every subtle tension, but also feeling it as if it were your own. Most of us filter this out. We have psychological walls. But she did not. Her walls were paper thin. And so, what seemed like a superpower was also a torment. She could not stop noticing, and she could not stop absorbing. To protect herself, she withdrew. Solitude became her only refuge. Solitude has its price. The more she retreated, the lonelier she became, and the more society misunderstood her. People labeled her strange, difficult, even unstable. They had no idea that her suffering came not from delusion, but from the unbearable clarity of perception. Jung wrestled with this. He did not want to pathologize her. He did not want to reduce her to a diagnosis. He understood that what she was experiencing was not a disease, but a form of consciousness most of us could not imagine. At the same time, he knew it was destroying her ability to live. She could not function in ordinary roles, and she could not fit into the patterns of life that hold communities together. This was where Jung began to see a larger danger. If too much unconscious material becomes conscious, the psyche loses balance. It is like pulling a fish from the deep sea to the surface too quickly. The pressure difference destroys it. In the same way, when hidden truths rise too suddenly into awareness, the human personality can fracture. The unconscious is not meant to be fully illuminated. Some darkness is necessary. Some shadows must remain. This is a shocking idea, because we usually think more awareness is always better. We live in cultures that praise enlightenment, truth, seeking, self, knowledge, and honesty. We are taught to believe that ignorance is the enemy. But Jung saw that complete exposure is just as destructive as total blindness. The psyche needs both light and shadow, just as the body needs both waking and sleep. The unconscious protects us by holding what we cannot yet handle. When that barrier collapses, the individual is flooded with knowledge that feels less like wisdom and more like chaos. His patient embodied this collapse. She knew too much. She saw too clearly. She carried truths that others could not bear to admit, and because they could not bear them, they rejected her. It is one thing to be highly intelligent. Intelligence may make you isolated, but at least it is admired. Differentiated perception is different. People do not admire it, they fear it. They sense that you know their secrets, even if you never say a word. They sense that you are not fooled by their smiles. And fear quickly turns into hostility. This is why Jung described this discovery as dangerous, not because it threatened him or even the world at large, but because it threatened the very survival of people who carried this gift. They lived on the margins. They were misunderstood. They often suffered in silence, carrying burdens that had no name. Imagine living in a society where everyone is playing a part in a drama and you are the only one who sees the strings and the stage lights. Everyone else takes the play seriously. They laugh, they cry, they believe in the characters. You see through it. You know it is all performance. How could you continue to play along? How could you pretend to laugh at the jokes or cry at the tragedies when you know they are staged? This is what life felt like for Jung's patient. She could not enter the illusion. And once you have seen through illusion, pretending becomes almost impossible. Jung did not believe she was unique. He suspected that there were always a few people in every generation who possessed this kind of perception. They might not have the same life story, but they carried the same burden. They were often drawn to roles as healers, visionaries, outsiders, or critics of society. Sometimes they were revered as prophets. Sometimes they were condemned as mad. But in almost every case, they walked a lonely road because their vision separated them from the shared blindness that held everyone else together. This insight forced Jung to reconsider what health really means. If a patient suffers, we usually want to cure them. But what if their suffering is not an illness? What if it is a consequence of seeing too much truth? In that case, cure might mean teaching them how to carry their vision without being destroyed by it. It might mean helping them find solitude without falling into despair, or teaching them how to create symbolic expressions of what they see through art, myth, or ritual. For Jung, symbols and stories were not just entertainment. They were survival tools. They allowed unbearable truths to be carried indirectly, in forms that nourished rather than crushed the soul. By working with such patients, Jung began to realize that the human mind does not simply seek truth in raw form. It needs truth to be wrapped, softened, mediated. The unconscious provides this mediation through dreams, myths, and archetypes. When those mediating structures collapse, truth arrives naked, and naked truth is more than most human beings can survive. Jung kept reflecting on this patient long after their sessions ended, because she represented a mystery he could not ignore. She was proof that the psyche has hidden capacities far beyond what most people ever experience. Yet she also demonstrated that those capacities are not automatically blessings. They can just as easily become unbearable burdens. It forced Jung to confront a paradox. Human beings long for deeper awareness, yet deeper awareness can fracture a life. He began to see how society itself depends on blindness in order to function. Social life runs smoothly because most people only notice what is obvious and only speak about what is acceptable. If every person could see through the masks of others, daily life would become unbearable. Think about how often we rely on polite lies, on small talk, on casual phrases like, "I am fine," when we are not fine at all. These are not always acts of deception in a malicious sense. They are rituals of social survival. They allow us to move through the world without drowning in each other's hidden pains. But for people like Jung's patient, there was no escape from those hidden layers. They could not hear, "I am fine," without also hearing the despair underneath. They could not listen to laughter without detecting the anger it was covering. They could not sit in a room without being flooded by the silent tensions no one else dared to acknowledge. This was the true danger of their gift. The world is built on shared illusions, and when someone sees through those illusions, they are left stranded outside of human belonging. Jung sometimes described the unconscious as a protective container. It holds experiences, desires, and emotions that would overwhelm us if they came into the light all at once. For most people, that container works well. Dreams release a little here, slips of the tongue reveal a little there, but the larger structure remains intact. For the patient he described, the container was broken open. Everything leaked out at once. She was forced to live in a flood of unfiltered awareness. This made Jung think about the role of symbols and myth. Human beings cannot handle raw truth directly. That is why religions use stories and rituals, why cultures create myths, why dreams speak in images. These forms disguise truth, soften it, and make it digestible. They allow us to face the unbearable without being destroyed by it. The patient had no such buffer. For her, truth was raw and unmediated. She did not dream it symbolically. She saw it in people's faces and heard it in their voices. And raw truth is corrosive. It eats away at the possibility of ordinary life. Imagine living a single day without the protection of illusion. You wake up and instantly sense the exhaustion in your partner, the bitterness in your neighbor, the fear in the clerk at the grocery store, the resentment in your boss. Every word and gesture feels transparent to you. Every smile is half fake. Every reassurance is partly hollow. Every ambition is secretly tangled with envy. Could you live like that? Could you love, work, or laugh if all of that was constantly in your awareness? Most of us could not. and that is why Jung understood this perception as both rare and dangerous. The danger was not only personal, it was also social. Jung noticed that when people like his patient tried to speak the truths they perceived, they were often rejected, mocked, or punished. Society does not reward those who expose its illusions. In fact, it reacts defensively. A person who names the unspoken tensions in a family is often scapegoated. A person who sees through corruption in an institution is often expelled. A person who tells uncomfortable truths in a community is often silenced. People do not want their illusions shattered, even when those illusions are destructive. This is why many of these highly perceptive individuals fall into silence. They stop speaking what they see, not because they are unsure, but because they have learned that truth isolates them. They retreat into solitude, or they express their perception indirectly through art, poetry, or philosophy. In these forms, truth can be disguised enough to be tolerated, even admired. But when spoken directly, it is too threatening. Jung saw that there was also another danger. A person who constantly perceives the hidden emotions and motives of others can easily fall into despair, but they can also fall into arrogance. They can begin to believe that they are above ordinary people, that they alone see reality while others are blind. This kind of superiority can become destructive because it feeds bitterness and contempt. It can lead to isolation, not only because others reject them, because they reject others. He believed the only way forward for such individuals was humility and balance. They needed to understand that their gift did not make them superhuman. It made them different, but difference alone is not enough to create meaning. They had to learn how to live with what they saw without being consumed by it. They had to learn how to carry truths that could not be spoken directly, and they had to resist the temptation to see themselves as gods in a world of fools. The more Jung thought about this, the more he realized it applied not just to rare patients, but to society as a whole. Every culture depends on how much truth it is willing to face, and how much illusion it is willing to maintain. Too much illusion, and a society collapses into corruption, denial, and decay. Too much truth, and it collapses into chaos and despair. The balance between illusion and truth is fragile, and individuals who lean too far to one side often pay the price. For Jung, the patient he encountered in 1913 was a living example of what happens when truth overwhelms illusion. She showed him the risks of tearing the veil away too quickly. She showed him why the unconscious exists, why the psyche protects us with shadows and mysteries, why myths and dreams are necessary. She showed him that the mind is not designed for absolute clarity. It is designed for a balance of clarity and obscurity, of light and shadow. Without that balance, life itself becomes unlivable. Jung's reflections on this unusual patient continued to shape his work for many years, because he realized that what she represented was not an isolated curiosity, but a profound lesson about the human condition. She was not simply an individual with a strange sensitivity. She was a mirror showing what happens when the line between consciousness and the unconscious becomes too thin. He began to think about how every society deals with people who see too much. Throughout history, such people have appeared in many forms. Some were called prophets, others were called mystics, some were called visionaries, and many were simply dismissed as mad. What they all shared was the same fate of living at the edge of human experience, carrying truths that the majority could not or would not bear. Sometimes these individuals became great teachers, shaping religions, philosophies, and works of art. Other times they were destroyed, silenced, or driven into despair. Jung understood that the difference between those who survive and those who collapse often comes down to how they channel what they see. If they try to confront the world directly with their raw perception, the world rejects them. But if they learn to transform their vision into symbolic language, into myths, stories, or images, the world sometimes listens. This is why Jung gave such importance to symbols. A symbol does not present truth in its raw form. It clothes truth in an image, a story, a metaphor. And that clothing allows it to be tolerated, even embraced. He came to believe that this was the great task for individuals with extreme perception. They could not erase their gift, and they could not shut their eyes. But they could learn to carry what they saw in ways that would not destroy them. They could create art, write poetry, explore philosophy, or even invent rituals that gave form to the unbearable. In doing so, they could survive, and they could sometimes offer something valuable to others without being crushed by rejection. The patient who haunted Jung's memory never found that balance easily. Her life remained marked by solitude, tension, and misunderstanding. But through her, Jung glimpsed a universal truth. No one can live in complete darkness, but no one can live in complete light either. Too much unconscious material leaves us blind, trapped in compulsions we do not understand. Too much conscious clarity leaves us paralyzed, drowning in unbearable awareness. The human psyche is designed to stand between the two, to hold light and shadow in tension. That is where growth happens, and that is where meaning can be created. Jung also realized something humbling. For most of us, the unconscious performs an essential kindness. It hides what we are not yet ready to face. It allows us to live our lives without carrying the full burden of truth. It keeps secrets from us until the time is right, or sometimes forever. We may complain about our blindness, about our ignorance, about our repeated mistakes, but there is a hidden mercy in not knowing everything. The unconscious protects us from truths that would shatter us if we faced them too soon. This means that the longing for absolute clarity, for total self-knowledge, can itself be dangerous. Jung warned against the temptation to force open the unconscious, to expose every hidden corner, to drag every secret into the light. He believed such efforts often lead to breakdown, not enlightenment. The psyche reveals itself gradually through dreams, symbols, synchronicities, and experiences that come when we are ready. To demand more is like forcing a plant to grow faster by pulling on its stem. The result is destruction. The story of Jung's patient teaches us that seeing too much is not the same as understanding too much. Perception without balance is unbearable. Awareness without preparation is paralyzing. And truth without symbols is destructive. Human beings do not need absolute truth. They need livable truth, truth that can be carried without breaking the spirit. There is something deeply moving in this insight. It reminds us that our limits are not always flaws. Sometimes they are forms of protection. Sometimes blindness is mercy. Sometimes illusion is grace. And sometimes ignorance allows us to keep living loving, and creating in ways that raw truth would make impossible. Jung never stopped honoring the mystery of the unconscious. He did not see it as a storehouse of primitive chaos, as Freud sometimes did, but as a deep source of wisdom, creativity, and protection. It was the part of the psyche that balanced the conscious mind, offering symbols and images that helped human beings survive truths too heavy to hold directly. His patient showed him what happens when that balance is broken, and her suffering became a lesson about why balance matters more than extremes. We may never know exactly how many people in the world live with such extreme perception. They are rare, but they exist. Some struggle in silence, some retreat into solitude, and some manage to transform what they see into art, teaching, or healing. But all of them live on the edge of what the human psyche can bear. And through them, we are reminded that perception is not a simple blessing. It is a double-edged gift, and without balance, it can become unbearable. So, when we think about Jung's most dangerous discovery, it is not a discovery about madness or pathology. It is a discovery about truth itself. Too little truth leaves us blind, trapped in ignorance. Too much truth leaves us shattered, unable to live. Human beings must walk the narrow path between, carrying enough truth to grow, but not so much that they collapse. That is why we need myths, symbols, dreams, and illusions. That is why we need the unconscious. It is not our enemy. It is our guardian. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this. If you ever feel limited, if you ever feel blind, if you ever feel like you do not see everything clearly, remember that this may not be a flaw at all. It may be a form of protection. It may be the psyche's way of keeping you balanced, of making sure you can keep living without drowning in unbearable awareness. Jung's patient showed him what happens when that protection is stripped away. Her suffering was immense, but through her, he saw a truth that applies to us all. We do not need to see everything. We only need to see enough.